May 1945. The war in Europe was finally over. Germany had surrendered just days before, and the Nazi dream of ruling the world had turned to ash. Across the ruined cities of Germany, over 400,000 German soldiers now sat in prisoner of war camps, waiting to learn their fate. Among them were young men who had believed every word Adolf Hitler told them. For 12 long years, they had listened to propaganda on the radio, read it in newspapers, and heard it from their teachers. They were told that Germany was the greatest nation on earth. They were told that their enemies were weak and starving. They were told that Britain, bombed by German planes and rockets, was on its knees and ready to collapse. These prisoners came from cities that no longer existed. Hamburg had been burned to the ground, with 60% of its buildings turned to rubble. Berlin was a landscape of broken concrete and twisted metal, with 30% of the capital destroyed. Dresden had been bombed so heavily that entire neighborhoods were just ash. The men who survived had walked through streets where they could not recognize their own homes. They had eaten bread mixed with sawdust because there was no real flour. They had watched their mothers and sisters stand in lines for hours just to get a tiny piece of meat. The average German civilian was surviving on only 1,412 calories each day. That was barely enough to stay alive. In the final months of the war, German soldiers had retreated across a devastated landscape. They had seen factories bombed into piles of bricks. They had crossed bridges that had been blown apart. They had marched past farms where nothing grew anymore. This was what war looked like to them. This was what they thought happened to every country that fought. When they were captured by British forces and told they would be sent to England, they knew exactly what to expect. They would see the same destruction they had seen at home. They would find hungry people digging through ruins. They would discover that the British were just as broken as the Germans. One of these prisoners was named Hans Weber. He was 24 years old, though he looked older after years of fighting. Hans had grown up in Essen, an industrial city in western Germany. His father had worked in a steel factory. His mother had kept a small apartment with flowers in the window boxes. Hans remembered Sunday dinners with roasted chicken and potatoes with gravy. But that life was gone now. The last time Hans saw his street, it was a crater. The factory where his father worked was a skeleton of twisted metal beams. He did not know if his family was even alive. Hans and hundreds of other prisoners were loaded onto British military trucks at a processing camp in Dover. The British soldiers who guarded them were tired, but not cruel. They gave the prisoners water and a piece of bread for the journey. The trucks had canvas covers stretched over metal frames, blocking most of the view outside. But canvas is not solid. It flaps in the wind. It has gaps and tears. And through those small openings, the prisoners could peek at the country they were entering. The trucks rumbled north through England, heading toward camps in Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire. Inside, the German prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches. Nobody spoke much. They were exhausted, defeated, and afraid of what came next. Hans sat near the back of the truck, close to where the canvas cover did not quite meet the frame. A strip of daylight showed through the gap. He could not help himself. He leaned forward and looked outside. At first, he saw only a blur of green. Then his eyes focused, and he saw more clearly. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, covered in thick grass. Stone cottages sat peaceful in small villages, with smoke rising from their chimneys. Sheep grazed in fields bordered by old stone walls. Children played in a village square, chasing each other and laughing. A church stood tall with its steeple pointing to the sky, completely intact, not a single stone missing. Trees lined the roads, their branches full and healthy. Everything looked clean. Everything looked whole. Everything looked like nothing bad had ever happened here. Hans blinked hard. He rubbed his eyes. This could not be real. This could not be England. For years, he had heard about the Blitz, about German bombs falling on London night after night. He had seen newsreels showing fires and destruction. He had been told that British factories were smashed, that British farms produced nothing, that the British people were desperate and starving. The propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, had promised them that the V-2 rockets would break British spirit and force them to surrender. But the countryside Hans saw through that gap in the canvas looked like a painting of paradise. It looked untouched. It looked prosperous. It looked peaceful. Other prisoners noticed Hans staring and pushed closer to see. One by one, they pressed their faces near the gap. One soldier, a man from Munich, started crying silently. Another man from Frankfurt whispered a single word that made everyone go quiet. He said, "Impossible." But it was not impossible. It was real. The truck kept moving, and the green countryside kept rolling past. Village after village appeared, all intact, all functioning, all normal. Hans felt something crack inside his chest. It was a feeling he did not have words for yet. It was the first hint that everything he had believed might be wrong. If Britain looked like this, then what else had been a lie? The truck rumbled on through the English countryside, carrying men who were starting to question everything they thought they knew about the war, about their enemies, and about themselves. The trucks arrived at Eden Camp in North Yorkshire late in the afternoon. The camp was made up of dozens of long metal buildings called Nissen huts. They looked like giant tin cans cut in half and laid on the ground. Barbed wire surrounded the whole area, and guard towers stood at each corner. Hans and the other prisoners climbed down from the trucks, their legs stiff from the long ride. British soldiers directed them toward the registration building. 1,200 German prisoners of war would call this place home, at least for now. After processing, the guards led Hans and his group to their assigned hut. Inside, there were rows of metal bunk beds with thin mattresses and 2 blankets each. It was simple but clean. Hans had slept in far worse places during the war. He had spent nights in frozen trenches and bombed-out buildings. This was a palace compared to that. But the real shock came an hour later when a guard announced it was time for dinner. The prisoners lined up outside a large building that served as the mess hall. Hans expected watery soup and a crust of stale bread. That was what prisoners got, or at least that was what he thought. When he stepped inside, his nose was hit by smells he had almost forgotten. Something was cooking, something real. The line moved forward, and each man received a metal tray. A British cook stood behind a counter, spooning food onto each tray with a steady hand. Hans held out his tray and watched as the cook placed a thick slice of white bread on it. Real white bread. Not the dark, heavy Kriegsbrot mixed with sawdust that German soldiers had eaten. This bread was soft and pale and perfect. Next came a pat of margarine and a spoonful of strawberry jam. Then a ladle of hot vegetable stew with actual chunks of potato and carrot visible in the broth. Finally, a tin cup of tea, and the cook poured milk into it from a small pitcher. Milk. Hans stared at the white liquid swirling in his tea. He had not seen fresh milk in 2 years. In Germany, milk was reserved for children and the sick. Grown men did not get milk. Hans sat down at a long wooden table with the other prisoners. Nobody spoke. They were all staring at their trays. One man picked up the white bread and squeezed it gently, as if testing whether it was real. Another man lifted his cup of tea to his nose and inhaled the smell of the milk. Then, slowly, they began to eat. The bread was soft and slightly sweet. The jam tasted like summer. The stew was hot and filling. Hans ate every bite and felt his stomach, which had been tight with hunger for so long, finally relax. Later, Hans learned that each prisoner received 2,900 calories of food every single day. That was more than German soldiers had gotten even in 1944, when the war was still going well for Germany. Each week, every prisoner was given 14 ounces of meat, 56 ounces of bread, 8 ounces of sugar, and unlimited potatoes. Hans did a quick calculation in his head. His mother, back in Essen, if she was still alive, was probably surviving on less than half of what he was eating now as a prisoner. One prisoner, an older man named Friedrich, who had been a school teacher before the war, said what everyone was thinking. They feed us better than we fed ourselves before the war started. Nobody argued with him. It was simply true. The contrasts kept coming. After 2 weeks at the camp, Hans and a group of prisoners were assigned to work on local farms. The British needed help bringing in the harvest because so many of their own men had been killed or injured in the war. Guards loaded the prisoners onto a truck each morning and drove them to a farm about 5 miles from the camp. The farmer, a red-faced man named Mr. Thompson, showed them what needed to be done. He spoke slowly and used hand gestures so they could understand. What struck Hans immediately was the equipment. Mr. Thompson had 2 tractors. They were old and a bit rusty, but they worked. In Germany, Most farms had been using horses for years because there was no fuel for tractors. Here in Britain, even with rationing, farmers still had enough petrol to run machines. The farm had electric lights in the barn. The fences were properly maintained. The fields were planted in neat rows. Everything worked. Everything functioned. This was a country that had been at war for 6 years, and yet it still operated like a normal place. Around mid-morning, Mr. Thompson's wife came out to the field carrying a large thermos and a basket. She poured hot tea into cups and handed them to the prisoners. She smiled at them, not with pity or hatred, but with simple kindness. "You boys must be thirsty," she said. Hans accepted the cup with both hands and nodded his thanks. He could not speak English well yet, but he understood her gesture. She saw them as human beings, not as monsters or enemies, just young men far from home. On Sundays, some prisoners were allowed to attend church services in the nearby village. A guard always came along, but the villagers did not seem to mind. Children stood outside the church and waved at the prisoners as they walked past. They were curious, not afraid. Inside the church, Hans sat in a back pew and listened to the minister speak in English. He understood only a few words, but the feeling was familiar. The hymns sounded different, but the act of singing together felt the same as it had in his childhood church in Essen. Hans noticed that the village had electric streetlights. Every house had a chimney with smoke rising from it, which meant people had coal or wood for heating. The railway station at the edge of town had trains that ran on schedule. He saw trucks delivering goods to shop. He saw people shopping, children going to school, and workers heading to jobs in factories. The war had touched Britain, yes. There was rationing, and people looked tired. But the country was unbroken. The lights still worked. The trains still ran. The factories still produced. At night, lying in his bunk at the camp, Hans could not stop thinking about what he was seeing. The British were supposed to be finished. Goebbels had said so on the radio 1,000 times. The V-2 rockets were supposed to have destroyed their will to fight, but instead they were functioning better than Germany had been even before the war ended. Hans found a scrap of paper and a pencil stub. He wrote carefully in small letters, hiding the paper under his mattress when he was done. The words he wrote were simple but dangerous. If they lied about Britain, what else was a lie? He did not know the answer yet, but the question kept him awake long into the night. November 1945. 6 months had passed since Hans arrived at Eden Camp. The leaves had turned gold and brown and fallen from the trees. Winter was coming, and the air had a sharp bite to it. Hans had settled into a routine of work, meals, and sleep. He had learned some English words. He had made a few quiet friendships with other prisoners. He had stopped feeling quite so shocked by the abundance around him. But he was not prepared for what happened on a cold Tuesday afternoon when all the prisoners were ordered to gather in the largest hut at the camp. British soldiers set up a white screen at one end of the building and a film projector at the other. The camp commander, a stern-looking officer with grey hair, stood in front of the assembled prisoners. He spoke in clear, slow English, and a German-speaking translator repeated his words. "You are going to watch something," the commander said. "Some of you may not want to see it, some of you may not believe it, but you will watch it because you need to know the truth about what your country did." The lights went out. The projector clicked and whirred to life. Images appeared on the screen in black and white. At first, Hans could not understand what he was looking at. There were piles of something, but his brain refused to recognize what they were. Then the camera moved closer, and he saw bodies. Hundreds of bodies stacked like firewood. Skeletal arms and legs tangled together, faces frozen in expressions of horror and pain. The film showed British soldiers walking through a camp called Bergen-Belsen. The soldiers looked sick. Some of them were crying as they worked. Bulldozers pushed the bodies into huge pits in the ground because there were too many to bury one at a time. The film continued. Living people appeared on screen, but they barely looked human. Their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were huge and hollow. They could hardly walk. They reached out to the British soldiers with stick-thin arms. The narrator's voice explained that these people had been starved and worked to death. They had been treated like animals, or worse than animals. This was a concentration camp. one of many scattered across Germany and Poland. This was where people were sent to die simply because of who they were. Hans felt his stomach twist. Around him in the dark, he heard other prisoners breathing hard. Someone was quietly sobbing. Another man got up and tried to leave, but a guard gently pushed him back into his seat. "You will watch," the guard said quietly. "All of it." The film showed more camps: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald. Each one was worse than the last. Ovens where bodies had been burned, gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, medical experiment rooms, warehouses full of stolen belongings, shoes, glasses, children's toys, human hair. The numbers were unbelievable. Millions of people murdered, millions. Not soldiers who died fighting, but ordinary people who had been rounded up and killed for no reason except hatred. When the lights came back on, Hans could not move. His hands were shaking. His mind was trying to reject what he had just seen, trying to say it was fake or exaggerated, but he knew it was real. The film had been too raw, too horrible to be anything but true. He had heard rumors during the war, whispers about camps and trains taking people away. He had never believed the rumors. He had thought they were enemy propaganda meant to make Germany look bad. Now he understood that the propaganda had been on the other side. Germany had lied. His own country had lied about everything. That night, Hans could not sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the curved metal ceiling of the Nissen hut. He kept seeing the images from the film, but he also kept thinking about other things. He thought about the British farmer's wife, who had brought them hot tea in the field. He thought about the village children who waved at them. He thought about the nurse at the camp infirmary who had carefully bandaged the infected cut on his hand, taking her time to make sure it was done properly, speaking to him in a gentle voice, even though she did not speak German and he barely spoke English. He thought about the church service, where the British minister had nodded at the German prisoners with kindness in his eyes. The British had every reason to hate Germans. Their cities had been bombed. Their sons and husbands and fathers had been killed fighting against Germany. They had seen what the concentration camps looked like. They knew what evil had been done. And yet they fed German prisoners good food. They gave them warm beds. They treated them like human beings. Hans realized something that made his chest ache. The British had shown more humanity to their enemies than Germany had shown to anyone. He whispered to himself in the darkness, words that felt dangerous even to think. "We were told we were the master race, that we would rule Europe, that our enemies were less than human, but they treat us with more humanity than we treated anyone." The words hung in the cold air of the hut. Nobody answered. But Hans knew he was not the only one thinking these thoughts. Spring came in 1946, and with it came new work assignments. Hans was sent to Sheffield, a city in northern England that had been damaged by German bombs. He and a group of other prisoners were assigned to help rebuild houses that had been destroyed. They worked alongside British construction workers, mixing concrete, carrying bricks, and hammering nails. The work was hard but honest. One of the British workers was a man named George. He was about 40 years old with rough hands and a weathered face. George shared his cigarettes with the German prisoners during breaks. He taught Hans English words for different tools and building materials: hammer, nail, saw, brick, wall, roof. Hans practiced the words carefully, and George corrected his pronunciation with patience. At the construction site office, a young woman named Margaret worked as a secretary. She organized the work assignments and kept track of supplies. She had kind eyes and brown hair pinned back neatly. When Hans struggled to fill out his timesheet in English, she helped him, speaking slowly and pointing to each line. Once, when he got the words right, she smiled at him. Hans felt his face grow warm and looked away quickly. One day, while they were eating lunch, Hans asked George in his broken English why he was kind to German prisoners. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My son died at Normandy. He was 19. A German bullet killed him." Hans felt his face go hot with shame. He started to apologize, but George held up his hand. "War's over, mate," George said simply. "You're just a bloke now, just a man. No point in hating you for what's already done." Hans thought about those words for a long time. Just a man, not a Nazi, not an enemy, just a man. It was such a simple idea, but it cut through everything he had been taught. Propaganda had told him that some people were better than others, that Germans were superior and everyone else was inferior. But here was George, who had lost his own son, treating Hans like an equal, treating him with more decency than Hans deserved. Back at the camp, there was a library with over 1,200 books. Prisoners were allowed to borrow them and read during their free time. The books were not propaganda. They were novels and history books and newspapers from Britain and America. Hans read about something called democracy, where people could vote and choose their leaders. He read about the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were being put on trial for their crimes. He saw their faces in the newspapers, men he had once thought were heroes. Now he saw them for what they really were, criminals who had led a whole nation into evil. Everything Hans had believed was turning upside down. The British countryside, green and peaceful and untouched, had been the first crack in his worldview. The abundance of food and kindness had widened that crack. The films of the concentration camps had shattered everything completely. Now he was rebuilding himself, one new thought at a time, learning what strength really meant. It was not cruelty or conquest. It was George sharing his cigarettes even though his son was dead. It was the farmer's wife bringing tea to men who came from the country that had bombed her homeland. It was the quiet dignity of a nation that had every reason to seek revenge but chose mercy instead. August 1948. 3 years had passed since Hans first saw the green hills of England. He was 27 years old now, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He stood on a railway platform with dozens of other German prisoners who were finally being sent home. The war had been over for more than 3 years, but Britain had kept the prisoners working to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. Now it was time for them to return to Germany and rebuild their own country. Hans carried a small cloth bag with everything he owned. Inside were the clothes on his back, a bar of soap, a tin of English breakfast tea that the farmer's wife had given him as a goodbye gift, and a set of carpentry tools that Mr. Thompson had pressed into his hands the day before. "You'll need these more than I will," the farmer had said. Hans also carried things that could not be seen or touched. He carried the memory of kindness from people who should have hated him. He carried the knowledge of what his country had done. He carried a new understanding of what words like strength and civilization really meant. These invisible things weighed more than anything in his bag. The train rolled south through England one last time. Hans looked out the window at the countryside he had come to know so well. The fields were green and full of crops ready for harvest. The villages looked peaceful in the summer sunshine. Everything was still intact, still functioning, still quietly beautiful. He wondered if he would ever see England again. He wondered if Germany would ever look like this. The train crossed the English Channel on a ferry and then continued through France and into the occupied zones of Germany. As they got closer to the border, Hans noticed the change. Bomb craters appeared beside the tracks. Burned-out tanks rusted in fields. Buildings stood as empty shells with no roofs and no windows. The train crossed into Germany at Aachen, and Hans pressed his face to the window. The city was ruins. Mountains of rubble lined the streets. People picked through the broken bricks, looking for anything useful. Children played in the shadows of collapsed buildings. This was home. This was Germany in 1948. 3 years after the war ended, it still looked like the war had happened yesterday. The train took 2 days to reach Essen because the tracks were damaged in so many places. When Hans finally stepped onto the platform in his hometown, he barely recognized it. The station roof was gone, open to the sky. The buildings around the square were mostly destroyed. The factory where his father had worked was still a skeleton of twisted metal, just as it had been 3 years ago. Nothing had been rebuilt. Nothing had improved. If anything, it looked worse because now the rubble was old and settled and permanent-looking. Hans walked through streets that used to be familiar. He had to stop and think hard to figure out where he was because all the landmarks were gone. Finally, he found the building where his mother had lived. Half of it had been destroyed, but the other half was still standing. He climbed the stairs, which smelled of damp and rot. He knocked on the door of what used to be his family's apartment. His mother opened the door. She was 52 years old but looked 70. Her hair had gone completely gray. Her face was thin and lined with worry. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she gasped and pulled him into a hug, sobbing into his shoulder. "Hans," she kept saying. "Hans, You're alive. You're home. The apartment was one room now. A bomb had destroyed the other rooms, so his mother lived in what used to be the kitchen. There was a single bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a hot plate for cooking. The window was covered with cardboard because there was no glass. Water came from a shared tap in the hallway, and it was cold because there was no fuel to heat it. The toilet was shared by 6 families on the floor. Hans set down his bag and looked around. This was what his mother had been living in for 3 years while he slept in a warm hut and ate 2,900 calories a day. That evening, his mother made a thin soup from potatoes and a tiny bit of bacon fat. She apologized that there was not more. The ration in Germany was still only 1,550 calories per person each day. The black market had better food, but it cost more money than most people had. Hans ate the soup slowly, making it last. It was not enough to fill his stomach, but he did not complain. His mother watched him with worried eyes. "Was it terrible?" she finally asked. "In the prison camp? Did they hurt you?" Hans set down his spoon. He looked at his mother, at her thin face and tired eyes, at the cracked walls of the tiny room, at the cardboard covering the window. He thought about the warm Nissen hut. He thought about the white bread and jam. He thought about the British farmer's wife bringing hot tea. He thought about George, who had lost his son but still treated Hans like a human being. He thought about the village church and the children waving, and the green countryside that went on forever, untouched and peaceful. "Mutti," he said quietly, using the word he had called her as a child. "They fed us better than we are eating right now. They gave us warm beds and clothes and medical care. They treated us like men, not animals. And we," his voice caught in his throat, "we believed we were gods. We believed we were better than everyone else. We believed we had the right to rule the world. But they showed us what real civilization looks like." His mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "We were lied to, all of us, for so many years." Hans nodded. There was nothing more to say about it. In the years that followed, Hans became part of the generation that rebuilt Germany. It was called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Young men who had survived the war worked hard to create a new country from the ruins of the old one. Hans used the carpentry skills he had learned in England to find work in construction. Germany needed millions of new houses, and Hans helped build them. The work was hard, but it was honest work, and he was good at it. In 1950, Hans began writing letters to Margaret, the secretary from Sheffield who had helped him with his timesheets. He remembered her kind eyes and patient voice. After he returned to Germany, he found the courage to write to her. She wrote back. They exchanged letters for 2 years, carefully and shyly, getting to know each other across the distance. In 1952, Hans traveled back to England and married her. They returned to Germany together and built a life in the new country that was rising from the ashes. Hans and Margaret had 3 children. When the children were old enough to ask questions, Hans told them about the war. He did not hide anything or make excuses. He told them about the propaganda and the lies. He told them about the concentration camps and the evil that had been done. But he also told them about the British countryside and the kindness he had received as a prisoner. "I learned more about civilization in a Yorkshire prisoner of war camp than in 12 years of the Third Reich," he told them. His children never forgot those words. Years later, when researchers asked former German prisoners of war about their experiences, 67 out of every 100 men who had been held in Britain said they were treated well. Many of them said that their time in British camps had changed their lives. They had learned about democracy and human rights and the rule of law. They had seen what a decent society looked like, even after 6 years of war. They brought those lessons home with them and used them to build a better Germany. Hans lived to be an old man. In his final years, when his grandchildren asked him about the war, he always came back to the same memory. The moment when the canvas flap blew open on that truck in May 1945, the moment when he saw the British countryside for the first time, the green hills rolling away forever, the stone cottages with smoke rising from chimneys, the sheep grazing peacefully, the children playing without fear, the churches standing tall and whole. Those green hills were not just land, Hans told his grandchildren. They were proof that you do not need to conquer other people to be prosperous. You do not need to be cruel to be strong. You do not need lies to have pride. The British showed us that by how they lived and how they treated us, even after everything we had done to them. He paused and looked out the window of his comfortable home in the rebuilt city of Essen. I went to war for a lie, he said quietly, but I was captured by the truth. And the truth was green and rolling and kinder than anything I had been told to believe. That truth saved me. It gave me a second chance to be human, and I have tried every day since then to deserve that chance.